to give the next expert time. Daniel, are you ready now, or are there children in the background still jumping around?
There's still one missing, which will hopefully come in soon, but yeah, I think we're good now. I can give it a try. Yeah, so I'll jump into that pad and I'll try to share my screen, even though you all have the pad, but maybe it's easier if we all look at it the same way. So my first observation is whether we should actually be looking at the slides, for instance, Tim's or those that were presented before, and then have some brainstorming together. Like that's kind of what I had expected here. And then once you were changing the slides, I was kind of lost. I needed a place to put my notes, which is why I started this document. Okay. And now I'll just dump my brain dump on you, and hopefully it will make sense if we then exchange some words over it. So yeah, there's a bit of background. That's kind of the preparation that I fished out of the inviting emails. And yeah, the guiding thoughts. So Tim also commented on this, and he said, we don't want to push down a top-down approach into everybody's throat, right? They should be drinking what they want, because I just saw you take the cup. So, and I agree with that sentiment, but I do have a different approach that I would at least like to mention. So for that, I have to take a slight detour. I was involved in a project where we were trying to capture the content of hypotheses. Several people were basically posting hypotheses. Other people were trying to test these hypotheses. There were some incongruencies noticed. And in the end, some of the problems with the reproducibility of the data, they actually boiled down to the phrasing of the hypothesis. People referred to certain hypotheses in a certain way, using a short name, for instance, but they never really fleshed it out. Like, how did they actually phrase the hypothesis for themselves? Which basically means there is a diversity of representations of hypotheses in the world, and they are not really always formalized, which then makes it hard to have a very specific argumentation or even testing on that basis. And here I'm roughly equating your guiding thoughts with those hypotheses. And I think it is valuable to have this standard vocabulary that Tim was referring to. It is also valuable to have the diversity, but I think we should force the diversity into let's say, into a more standardized format. So allow for diversity, but try to bring it into a format that we can pinpoint to, that we can give a number to that particular expression of that particular guiding thought. And so one way could be we just let them all type it out in some way, and then we take a hash or something, and that gives us that number. Maybe that's not the most useful. We can be a bit more systematic. And we've actually tried to do this for these hypotheses. So that's called formalization of hypotheses. And what we were using for that is a tool called nanopublications. If you haven't heard about this, it's not a big deal yet. But the basic idea is that you try to formalize your hypothesis, in this case, using only controlled vocabulary. So you say something A does something, some relationship B, or has some relationship B with something C. And you can make it a bit more complex, but roughly it's these semantic triples. And then you can say that's your hypothesis. And the details, you can either pack them in the A, the B, or the C, or in some of the decoration that you put around that. But still, all of this relates to controlled vocabulary. So if somebody else then wants to test your hypothesis, they would have to use the vocabulary that you have proposed. And but still, otherwise you're not limited in terms of the vocabulary that you use. And if you don't find a suitable term or concept in existing ontologies, you can just make one up and basically create a new Wikidata item. You can use that. So, and I linked a workflow where we did this. This is the paper. This is the section in the paper where we are describing the nanopublications. And here's a sample nanopublication that does this for one. So we have like 12 or so different expressions for the same hypothesis, but it differs in slight details, which then is important if you try to actually test the hypothesis. Under certain circumstances, it is important that there is this little addition here, or that there is this slight modification there, because in your experimental setup, or in whatever kind of research setup you're using, you will have slightly different variations. So you can only control some of those things, right? Well, having said that, I'll jump now to another thing. Ranking popped up in a number of contexts. And so I just wanted to show a little tool here that I like. All our ideas that came out of ranking ideas in terms of public participation in democracy, essentially. And so what you do there is you just stuff all your ideas in there in whatever format you have them. And then you let people compare only 2 of those. You can have 100 or 200 or 2,000. They get a random set of 2, and then they have to say which one is better. And if you do that often enough, or if enough people do this often enough, you get a ranking. And I use this quite frequently. I like it. And maybe that's useful here. We could think about some mechanism to involve the community in this kind of ranking. Then target groups. Here I'm still, knowledge graph. I didn't explain what a knowledge graph is, but I'll get to this maybe later. My main point was here, when you're asking for the target groups, I think in the questionnaire you have a drop-down menu, and you allow for like 6 or so target groups, right? And that's good. That is the kind of formalization that we need. And in a knowledge graph, we would need to replicate that. So basically, you would need to think whether those 6 or so options that you have actually map to some entity that is used somewhere else. So that basically goes back to that ontology idea that I was mentioning before. Because if that's the case, then it's more easy to compare this with things that others have done, or to annotate maybe papers or events or other things, policies, for instance, or funding calls as being related to those kind of target groups. Then when I saw the mentioned data protection and IP, the and triggered me, because in terms of when you want to model things in ontology terms, an and is always a problem, because it basically combines 2 things that are already recognized as being different. And in Wikidata, we call this the Bonnie and Clyde problem. In some Wikipedias, you have an article about Bonnie and Clyde as the team. In some, you have an article about just Bonnie. And in another, you have an article just about Clyde. And in some, you have an article about all 3. And some, you have none. And Wikidata then has to show, well, basically that people want to know, if I'm on this article on the English Wikipedia, does French have the equivalent? But what's the equivalent of the Bonnie and Clyde if on the other end, they model this differently, right? And similar things can be said about stereochemistry, or lots of things where different levels of granularity exist. And any and is an indicator that there is more granularity. And you should really think carefully about whether ignoring this is useful at this point. Now I'm getting to the knowledge graph. And as Tim had also noticed, you're starting from a literature review. And so I want to introduce the concept of a knowledge graph by showing you briefly a tool that is based on a knowledge graph and allows you to do a literature review without you doing anything, essentially. And that is based on Wikidata, which is a knowledge graph. And so here we are doing a superficial, but still a literature review on the topic of open science. And we do this by querying the knowledge graph, Wikidata, which gives us live results. So here we learn, for instance, open science is a subclass of open knowledge, or it's an instance of, what is this, social movement, and all sorts of things, has characteristic open. Well, hey, somebody was really trying to be formal. And all of this can be debated. It has part citizen science and things like this, but at least there is some starting point. And it's called a graph because essentially everything's connected, or everything can be connected to something else, always by these triples. A So subject, predicate, object, like a very simple sentence in, like, for instance, English. Subject, predicate, object, like Berlin, capital, Germany, something like this, right? And then Germany, continent, Europe, planet Earth, and so on. You can connect everything, and each of these things would get their own basically identifier, which basically determines their location in the graph, and you can find them based on this identifier. And yeah, then you can get the most recent. That's just here for the topic of open science. We're building a topic profile for this concept here. You can then get things like the most recently published papers, frequent authors, topics that co-occur with open science, for instance, yeah, ORCID, open data, open access, citizen science, these kind of things. And yeah, you can map them. Sometimes it actually co-occurs with a certain country. Yeah, so here, digital humanities in Burkina Faso. Okay, yeah, things like that. And all of these things, why is this relevant? It's a knowledge graph. So all of these things are generated by querying the knowledge graph, which basically is a complicated way of saying, hey, give me all the triples that meet certain criteria. Give me, for this thing, this was a map here. Give me all the triples where an organization is involved with a publication of a paper on a topic of open science. And then for all these organizations, give me the geolocation and plot them on a map, right? And that's basically what this code here tells us. And that goes into the knowledge graph, pulls out this information and visualizes it. Okay, so now back. You can also, in Wikidata, and like in other knowledge graphs that have this kind of information, you can also ask more simple questions. So here it is basically, give me all the open access policies that you know about. And then you get 655, for instance. Then you can go here, Aalto University open access policy. What is known about this? It's an open access policy from 2014. The link is here. It's by Aalto University, and it has this identifier and the raw map ID, right? So these are things that you can get from a knowledge graph. Now to the report. You were saying it has to be easy to read, and that is often wanted and rarely achieved. I think you need to clarify, well, you were already discussing what are the target audiences, and then you need to basically clarify what kind of knowledge do you expect them to have. And here I would encourage you to be explicit. Like, before embarking on reading that giant PDF, please make sure that you have a basic understanding of X, Y, and Z, and then please link some information that provides this background knowledge. As far as I've seen, this is actually not the case on the website. The website kind of still assumes a lot of knowledge about the project and doesn't really pick the people up where they are, basically. This also includes language. We've already discussed that the meeting here is taking place in English. People filling in the forms or the survey, they might not have English as their native language or even a language they use frequently. And so that will have an impact. There are other distinctions to be made, like specialist versus general language, in terms of being as precise as possible or being as understandable as possible. That doesn't always go together. And so maybe you also want to adjust the language to a particular target audience. If you're talking to, let's say, open science practitioners versus people who educate trainers or so, you might be using different language, and that needs to be reflected in a report in some way. You could have different chapters that are written for different audiences, or you could have the report generated more or less on the fly for different audiences. Like nowadays, you can ask an AI, hey, please write this down for like a 12-year-old who just came back from a party, right? In principle, some ChatGPT and friends, they can do this. Then the reading also needs to take into account different reading styles. Like, for instance, there's rarely a person that swallows a PDF wholesale and front to bottom. Many people engage in cursory reading. Maybe they actually search for something, or they just browse the images or the references or something. Then you can actually read it from front to back, or you can read it in other. Some actually start at the back or whatever. You can read it in different ways. And so far, I smell a PDF. I'm allergic to PDF, so I just want to point this out. Then multiple exploration paths, especially if you have rich data, and that's where knowledge graphs are a good example. If you have rich data, you need to provide multiple exploration paths, because what might be the beginning for some, or the starting point for somebody, might actually be the end point for somebody else. Because yeah, that's what rich data basically means. And so you need to think about, okay, maybe if I start like from the planet Earth, and I want to explore some of the individual things there, at some point I might end up in places like Berlin or Kiel. But that's a different place than if I start in Kiel, right? And it's a different journey, different motivations, different kinds of decisions to be made, and so on. Then I would like to mention that there is a project called Servicestelle for Diamond Open Access. So service point, national service point for Diamond Open Access, that I'm involved in Germany. And they plan to do an innovation lab for scholarly publishing, basically. And if you want to make this report more interesting, maybe we can work together on your report being a guinea pig in terms of such innovations. Then on demographics, I like the idea. I think Tim brought it up in the slide, right? I'm not sure whether it was explicitly mentioned before. The demographics is an interesting aspect, and it may not come out of your data, or it may require additional questions in the questionnaire or something like this. But also in some cases, you can actually infer it from other sources. And I've linked here an example where we did this in the context of a question from the US government, well, some years ago when it was still kind of rational. They were asking, what's the value of open source in terms of its contributions to the national economy? And they were venturing off into different directions. One of the directions that I ended up being involved in was, okay, let's have a look at GitHub and how many people engage into contributions to GitHub. And then can we say anything about the people who are contributing there? And on GitHub itself, they rarely provide demographic information in a useful fashion. You often don't even have the real names, and let alone anything further. But Wikidata to the rescue. Wikidata is capturing for a lot of people, especially scientists, their GitHub and other profiles on social media. And then in Wikidata, we might have additional information like their affiliation or whether they've published on Open Science or those kind of things. And here in this little notebook that I shared, we were, for instance, looking at differences between male and female contributors to open source software projects. And we found some differences. So for instance, the females tended to be more attentive to a smaller number of projects, and then they were more, let's say, they were providing more contributions to that smaller number. And the males were a bit more distributed in the way they contributed. And so demographics can be used even under certain circumstances, even if you don't have them explicitly in your sample. But that requires a certain mapping between your sample or a good correspondence. Then in terms of educational content, I was reminded of a project I did some years ago on math interventions, where we also tried to basically map the literature about math interventions. And there is, there's a, let's call it an authority in the US, or a database, ERIC, that you probably all know. And I've linked here some examples. There's also the What Works Clearinghouse, and they have looked at all of these things. typically from a K-12 perspective, which is not the normal context in which open science is taught or learned, but it could be. Like I have given open science classes to K-12, but maybe some of what they do there could actually be also useful for your literature survey. And then the themes. So yeah, annotating the literature or annotating the guiding thoughts or annotating any of the things that you're analyzing can result in themes, but here it does matter as to how many themes you want to cater to. So I'm giving two examples here. One for this math intervention thing, we were using dozens of themes and we were mapping the literature to those dozens of themes. And that wasn't quite handy, and different people often came up with quite different annotations. And in a different project, we went through invasion biology as a field. That's about 50,000 papers altogether. And we chose just 5 themes. And they were relatively consistent across different, let's say, researchers who evaluated the research. But still, 5 is not a large number, especially for 50,000. And so maybe 5 is too little for what you want. But 5 was a certain effort, I have to say. And also, for that particular case, we actually had a different level at which we annotated the things. And that was the hypothesis that I already mentioned. So we were basically interested in interactions between hypotheses and themes. And since you seem to be interested in kind of inferring the themes from the guiding thoughts, maybe that doesn't work in this case, but I just wanted to mention it at least. And then here, yeah, one AI popped up in different contexts. And so one thing that could be done is you take the responses that you get, the free floating, the free text responses, and feed them into an AI or some data mining module to see whether it can find, for instance, papers that make the same claim as in that particular response. That could then be an interesting resource to discuss further about that particular guiding thought or that particular thing that is discussed in that particular question of the survey. Yeah, so these were my initial gut reactions, not really thought through. And yeah, happy to hear any comments, and I'm happy to basically stare with you together at some of the slides because I didn't manage to capture all the thoughts I had while I was looking at those slides.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Okay, so open the floor to ask. That was really a lot. Yeah, so I'm still, but thank you very much. Okay, I see the questions are coming in. So Marie, you go first.
Yes, thank you very much, Daniel. You mentioned regarding the guiding thoughts that we need a standard vocabulary for a knowledge graph or whatever to be comparable, of course. Now, as you know, we have more qualitative questions and answers. So the explanations that are coming in, we might have more homogeneous guiding thoughts because we're presenting a list where we ask, do you have transparency, do you have accountability, and so on. But the explanations might be diverse. Also within one target group, not only between target groups. How can you imagine to structure this in order to reach a standard vocabulary, in order to feed it into a knowledge graph?
It's probably not going to work in one go, but if it's an iterative process, you can basically start with what you have. You can analyze the responses that you have. You can try to formalize those responses and then pull some of those responses from the first round into the question or the answer options in the next round. And then you have a mechanism by which you can make the responses more and more formal. And also, while you're formalizing this, you should probably also always provide an escape route. So for instance, you ask a question and then you provide, let's say, 5 answer options that you have formalized. But you should give people the option, no, none of this fits with what I would say, and then they can still do free text. And if you're good in transforming the free text into something formal, then less and less people will use the free text option. It will probably never go away entirely, but the proportion of people who opt for the free text should go down. And that means you get structured data. It is still cognizant of the diversity of the responses you got initially, but it then can capture like the guiding thoughts in a more formal way that actually lends itself to automated analysis and also potentially reuse. You could then build a Bonnie and Clyde kind of thing that expresses your guiding thoughts or the guiding thoughts of that particular community that responded to the survey at that particular point in time. And it can still be made machine readable, and people can build on it in a way that a normal qualitative thing can't, basically.
Okay. Are there any other questions? You check. Actually, I do have one, Daniel. So I'm still stuck with the hypothesis thing. These nano, I think you called them nano hypothesis, and I did
Nanopublications.
Nanopublications. So
Maybe
I think I could follow. Yeah. If you.
Okay, I'll share my screen again, and then I'll jump into that.
Yeah. So my question is, and you can explain that to me. I also understood that this was connected to bringing diversity down to a more general level, which we can refer to as a standard. And if so, how does it work in detail? Is it also an iterative process, which you just explained, which I can follow, and I think this is a very good thing? Or is it a different way to go?
No, I think it's essentially the same process. You can use nanopublications for that, but you don't need to. But if you use nanopublications, it will then give you the compatibility with the rest of the semantic web, because that is already an established process. You might consciously choose not to go all that way to being compatible with the semantic web, but maybe you say it's enough if we homogenize our responses just a little bit in that direction, so that we don't have the full-fledged diversity of everything that ever could be said on this topic. But you have a little bit of structure, or you could go all the way, and then like the nanopublications would help you along the last steps towards compatibility with semantic web. So to give you a flavor, the general or the hypothesis that we were discussing here is called the enemy release hypothesis. And we give here the history of it. And it was originally formulated just for terrestrial plants. It basically says that if a plant arrives in a new habitat, like for instance, it was transported by a ship from Europe to America or something like this, right? Then it arrives in a new habitat where it is freed from its enemies. That's why it's called the enemy release hypothesis. Not all its enemies have done the same travel. So some of its enemies will be left behind. And this means that some of the evolutionary pressures on that particular species are not there. There might be others. It might still be eaten quickly and die out, but still at least some of the pressure that it originally had and where it came from are gone. And this original thought had just been expressed for terrestrial plants. And then the question is, if you want to apply this to aquatic plants or to terrestrial animals or terrestrial slime molds or whatever, can you still call this the enemy release hypothesis? And that's the kind of basic idea. And so then also we collected a number of papers that were referring to this, and they said, oh, we tested the enemy release hypothesis, but they were actually testing it on snakes, for which the original wasn't actually made. And then the question is that actually testing the enemy release hypothesis? And so it boils down to the question, which version of the enemy release hypothesis have you actually tested? which is why you need to be very precise. Does it include the snakes? Does it include the terrestrial or the water plants? Or what does it include? And yeah, so that's what we tried here. So we have a number of free text descriptions of that same hypothesis here. So no constraints in terms of how this is worded was imposed on these people, because they all did that essentially before we came in, with the exception of this one, which is our summary, but still not constrained by ontologies. And all of these things we have then tried to, including this, where, and we've had other things where people essentially write half a page and then they say, and this is my hypothesis. And that makes it very hard to, some people even write books about it. And then they say, this is my hypothesis. That's how all the isms come from in philosophy, right? And if you want to test these kind of things, it's very hard, because there's lots of detail in this half a page or in that book that you can't actually cater to in your replication attempt. So what we did then is we rephrased these things. We took the same kinds of phrases and we converted them little by little into standard vocabulary. Well, things where synonyms, for instance, were mapped to a particular, let's say, preferred expression. And things like while and well, let's say complicated sentence structures, they were simplified. And in the end, we have this collection of nanopublications that then just looks like this. A nanopublication has three main parts. One is the core sentence is that triple of a fact. And then who did it? Who created that nanopublication? In this case, it was like 5 people. Or no, actually, the nanopublication itself was created by one person who collaborated with us on this. But the assertion comes from the 5 authors of that paper, right? So because the original authors of the different versions of that hypothesis didn't provide a nanopublications, we kind of interpreted their free text in the nanopublication space in this particular way. Yeah, so that's roughly how this works. And we went through all these different expressions of that same thought. And then you see differences like reduced pressure by enemies in a non-native range contributes to invasion success. Reduced per capita effect of enemies on species in a non-native range increases population level performance of non-native species. Here we have two new terms. Per capita effect on population level effect, because sometimes it's different. It's important to keep these distinctions in mind. And so you can be essentially nitpicking at being increasingly nitpicking, but becoming more precise, so that if you are making any claim about any of these formalized things, it should be easier to test. There's still ambiguity if you really search for it, but the ambiguity will be much reduced compared to the original free-floating text that you started with. Did that roughly explain it?
Yes, I think so. And I can see that you all did that on RIO. So is it RIO Journal? So is it a specific infrastructure you also need to put the nanopublications out, or could you do it everywhere? Very practical question.
It is, well, RIO is one of the few journals that have implemented it. In principle, any journal could implement it. And there is a nanopublication community that tries to talk to many journals. But the journals don't necessarily say hello and yes, we're going to do it when you approach them with a new idea. But yeah, RIO is experimental, and it happens to be a journal that I know, and so I participated in that. And so in RIO, you can express nanopublications like this already natively. You can comment on any text ever written in RIO and convert your comment into a nanopublication. You can comment on any text ever written anywhere else and convert it into a nanopublication. And then you can create new nanopublications of certain types from scratch using a RIO template. And the same works in a few other journals. There's the Data Science Journal, there's the Biodiversity Data Journal, and there are a few others, like a handful at the moment. But there are, all of this is according to web standards. And so even if RIO goes away, the nanopublications might still be there because they're expressed in semantic web terminology. And yeah, those standards might well exist for quite some time.
Thank you very much. So yes, I think there are more questions in the room, but we have to hold them a bit. Okay, so our next expert, Bernhard. So it's